Hello everybody, welcome to the final review discussion for ATM5 in preparation for the final exam. Note that this review only covers the material that I've covered in the second half of class. You'll have to go back to the midterm review slides in order to cover the first half of the class. This also doesn't cover material from Chris Kappa's guest lectures, which will be occurring next week. Please recall that he will be contributing probably one short answer and a couple multiple choice questions to the final exam. Okay, so the final exam, yay, it is on Monday, June 8th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. It covers all the course material, so everything from start to finish. It is a cumulative exam. It is a 2-hour time slot, so it's going to be about 1.5 to probably 1.75 times as long as the midterm. This means about 12 one-sentence definitions, about 4 short answer questions, and about 30 multiple choice questions. Again, the multiple choice questions, analogous to the midterm, will be taken half from online quizzes with the actual answers somewhat mixed up, but otherwise matching the online quizzes almost exactly, so please go back to your online quizzes and review the material from there. Okay, so let's go over the definitions that we had in the second half of class. In particular, you need to know the concepts related to the structure of the global circulation. So this involves the 3 primary cells that exist in the general circulation of the atmosphere, including the Hadley cell. Recall the Hadley cell occurs near the equator. It is bounded, it occurs on either side of the intertropical convergence zone, and the rising branch of the Hadley cell actually coincides with the intertropical convergence zone. The Hadley cell is the strongest of the 3 cells. It consists of rising motion along the ITCZ near the equator, followed by transport along the equatorial tropopause away from the equator, followed by sinking motion in the mid-latitudes, in the subtropics at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, and then convergence of winds towards the equator along the equatorial surface. The Ferrel cell is the next one up. This is the one that covers most of the mid-latitudes. It extends from about 30 degrees to 60 degrees in both hemispheres. The Ferrel cell is much weaker than the Hadley cell, and its features include sinking motion at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, and rising motion at the polar front at approximately 60 degrees north and south, again in both hemispheres. Make sure that your transport associated with these cells is consistent. That is, we expect that in all cells you get sinking motion at the subtropics at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, and rising motion at the polar cells at 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south. The polar cell then extends from 60 degrees north and south towards the poles. It's the last cell. It's again, a fairly weak cell compared to the Hadley cell. Where the polar cell and Ferrel cell meet, that's where you're going to see the polar jet stream. So the jet stream is another definition that we need to know. The jet stream is basically a region of enhanced zonal velocity that occurs at the intersection of cells. So there are 2 main jet streams in each hemisphere. These are the mid-latitudinal jet stream, or the subtropical jet stream, which occurs at 30 degrees north and south, and the polar jet stream, which occurs at 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south. The mid-latitudinal jet stream coincides with the intersection of the Hadley cell and the Ferrel cell, and the polar jet stream coincides with the Ferrel cell and the polar cell. Extratropical cyclones are a major mechanism by which energy is transported from equator to pole. The extratropical cyclones consist of cold cores, that is a cold central eye with a strong central low. The central low means that the extratropical cyclone rotates in the counterclockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and in the clockwise direction in the southern hemisphere. Again, extratropical cyclones, very important for equator to pole energy transport, particularly in the region between 30 degrees north and 60 degrees north and corresponding latitudes in the southern hemisphere. The Pacific High is a region of high pressure that exists off of the west coast of North America. It is centered roughly around California during the summer months and migrates southward during the winter months. The southward migration of the Pacific High allows for atmospheric rivers or extreme precipitation events to reach California from the subtropics. During the summer, the presence of the Pacific High blocks these atmospheric rivers from being able to reach California. So it is a major factor in determining the behavior of West Coast weather, particularly along the coast of California. We discussed various climate zones and various climate classifications. The main climate classification we talked about involved 6 main types of climate types. These included Arctic tundra, taiga, deciduous forest, tropical rainforest, tropical savanna, and desert. I'll refer you back to the slides in order to understand the key characteristics of each of these different climate zones. One of the climate zones we didn't discuss in detail is highland climate, and this is climate in basically mountainous regions. We then went on to discuss paleoclimate, and one of the key concepts that arose from the past climate record of the Earth was the usage of tree rings. This is a study known as dendroclimatology. Dendroclimatology is basically just the usage of tree rings in order to understand past temperature variations on the Earth. Other mechanisms by which Earth's temperature record was extracted include ice cores. Ice cores are extracted primarily from Antarctica, and one of the key ice core sites is the Vostok ice core site. These ice cores are extracted and provide a significant detail on atmospheric composition and surface temperatures at various times throughout the Earth's record. In particular, the different layers in the snow represent accumulations in each winter season, and so analogous to counting tree rings, we can count layers within the ice core in order to basically time when when different atmospheric compositions occur. These ice cores provide records back to about 15 million years ago during the last glaciation of Antarctica, and cannot provide records previous to that because Antarctica was not glaciated at the time, so no snow was available to accumulate. We discussed briefly the idea of the greenhouse climate, and that enhanced carbon dioxide concentrations lead to basically enhanced surface temperatures, and that surface temperatures are a very strong function of atmospheric composition. During times of greenhouse climate, you have melting of the polar ice caps. You can have tropical vegetation occurring in the polar regions, typically worldwide high temperatures, very strong vegetation worldwide, and high surface temperatures. One of the aspects that affected long-term Earth climatology was something which was known as the Milankovitch cycles. The Milankovitch cycles consisted of 3 key facets, including tilt, obliquity, and eccentricity of the Earth's orbit. These 3 factors then contribute to a cycle on a period between 41,000 years and 100,000 years that then reflect changes in the Earth's climate system on these timescales. When looking back at the past temperature record of the Earth over these timescales, these oscillations are very apparent, and it's clear that they are a major player in affecting overall Earth surface temperatures. We are currently sitting at a high in the Milankovitch cycle, so we anticipate that over the next 10,000 to 100,000 years that there will be a negative contribution to Earth's surface temperatures due to variations in the orbit. We talked about global modeling systems. So global atmospheric models are basically computational tools that allow us to experiment on the Earth system and understand the underlying mechanisms that connect to the various components of the Earth system. They are also useful in order to assess, for instance, Earth's future climate. We also talked about regional modeling systems, which are used, for instance, for numerical weather prediction, as well as regional scale climatology. The regional models are generally higher resolution than the global models. That is, there is a shorter distance between grid points in regional models than in global atmospheric models, and so it provides more detail on fine-scale behavior in the climate system and allows you to assess, for instance, microclimatic behavior in California. Numerical weather prediction models are used for short-term forecasting. Numerical weather prediction models typically don't include a full suite of physical parameterizations or physics like the global climate modeling systems do, because numerical weather models are more interested in high throughput, that is, very short run times in order to do forecasts on the order of 2 to 3 weeks. We also discussed the idea of a teleconnection, and basically the idea that some part of the Earth system can result in changes over large distances. So we saw examples of this in the various oscillations in the climate system, ranging from the Arctic Oscillation to the El Niño Southern Oscillation, and saw a variety of teleconnections in particular associated with ENSO. So the different oscillations that we discussed include the Arctic Oscillation being a pressure difference between the North Polar regions and the mid-latitudes. During the negative phase of the Arctic Oscillation, you typically have a very wiggly polar jet stream, which means that frigid Arctic air can be pulled southwards, farther south than normal, whereas during the positive phase mode, you typically have a very stable jet stream in terms of constant latitude. There are various aspects associated with the positive and negative modes of the Arctic Oscillation, and I refer you to the slides on oscillations in order to understand more about that. We also discussed the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is an oscillation in the ocean system, which is closely connected with the Arctic Oscillation. We discussed the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, again an oscillation in the ocean system associated with about a 1 degree change in sea surface temperatures. The Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation is a strong determining factor on the strength of tropical cyclones in the Atlantic. That is, during the positive sea surface temperature phase of the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, we observe stronger tropical cyclones in the Atlantic Basin, as well as wetter conditions in Florida and along the U.S. southeast coast. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation is the analogous oscillation that occurs within the North Pacific. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation occurs on a timescale of decades and is associated with warm sea surface temperatures in the Eastern Pacific and cooler temperatures in the North Pacific. I refer you to the slides in order to learn more about the connections associated with the PDO. The El Niño Southern Oscillation we spent a lot of time on because of the close connection that it has with weather in North America. The El Niño Southern Oscillation corresponds to two modes, the La Niña or normal condition mode and the El Niño or warm condition mode. In La Niña conditions, that is so-called normal conditions, we have a cold tongue in the Eastern Pacific, that is cold sea surface temperatures that extend across most of the Eastern Pacific and into the Central Pacific. During La Niña conditions, we observe strong precipitation in the West Pacific associated with strong convection and a strong low pressure region in the Western Pacific. This is due to a strong Walker circulation over the Pacific. That is, we have rising motion in the Western Pacific and transport east away from Australia over the Pacific and subsidence in the Central and Eastern Pacific from the Walker circulation. This is associated with easterly winds along the equatorial surface, that is, winds from the east, blowing to the west. This circulation is then responsible for driving ocean currents and driving ocean sea surface water from east to west. Consequently, you get warmer water to the west, and because of rising motion in the ocean on the eastern flank, you have cooler sea surface temperatures in the eastern flank. This is in contrast with the El Niño branch, which is a weakening of the Walker circulation and a appearance of low pressures over the Central Pacific. Consequently, convection and precipitation are then moved to the Central Pacific, where there's strong precipitation that occurs within that region, and weaker winds along the equatorial surface. This then results in warmer sea surface temperatures in the eastern Pacific. Because sea surface temperatures can rise by as much as 5 degrees Celsius in the eastern Pacific, this has a very strong effect on the overall energy balance of the Earth system, and that's how this oscillation then affects worldwide climate. The El Nino condition is associated with very wet, warm conditions throughout the southern U.S. and into southern California, as well as warmer weather across much of the Pacific Rim. It's also associated with relatively dry conditions in the western Pacific because the normal convective precipitation that occurs in the western Pacific will have migrated to the central Pacific. So after talking about oscillations, we also talked about atmospheric rivers. This comes into the discussion with the Pacific High that we mentioned before as well. Atmospheric rivers were a major contributing factor to the California drought, in particular the fact that we had no strong atmospheric river events over the California drought period. This is because that is the 2013 to 2014 drought period. This is because of the formation of a ridiculously resilient ridge off of the west coast of North America that then blocked subtropical precipitation from being transported via atmospheric rivers to California. Instead, because of that high pressure ridge and because a high pressure region is associated with clockwise circulation, the atmospheric river was then forced northwards and ended up impacting largely along the Alaskan coast, bringing higher than average precipitation to the Alaskan coast. We talked about drought severity in terms of the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which includes temperature, precipitation, and soil moisture into a single index that then describes the severity of the underlying drought, and showed that the Palmer Drought Severity Index reached a record-breaking low value, that is a negative value, during the 2013 to 2014 drought. That is, these drought conditions are unprecedented in the history of meteorological records for California, which stretch back to 1890. Mega droughts were also discussed, and in particular the fact that in looking at the tree ring record for California, we observed that there are actually periods between 150 and 200 years in duration occurring at the end of the last millennium, that is between 850 and 1050 AD, and again between 1150 and 1250 AD. These mega drought events were associated with periods of prolonged dry conditions throughout California and were suggestive of the drought conditions that we saw in 2013 and 2014 to be actually non-unique when examining the long-term history of drought conditions in California. So this led to some discussion on whether or not we will be emerging into relatively dry conditions, or whether California will be experiencing another mega drought event in the coming years. We also discussed the impacts of climate change on the global scale, and in particular the political response. We discussed the concepts of mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, namely being mechanisms to avoid the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases before they have the opportunity to cause trouble, and adaptation being the idea that we need to add infrastructure or somehow adapt to changes in the climate system. These two concepts are closely linked to one another. More mitigation at present will lead to less adaptation needed later, because the climate change consequences associated with stronger mitigation will be relatively weaker. With less mitigation, we expect to have a very strong climate change impacts, and consequently need to have more adaptation later on in order to adjust to these changes. We discussed the concept of adaptive capacity, and namely that different regions of the world and different populations have more capability to adapt to changes in climate than in other regions. In particular, we noticed that the developed world, that is throughout North America and throughout Europe and Australia, have very strong adaptive capacity, That is, they have the ability to adapt to changes in climate, whereas throughout the developing world, they have very weak adaptive capacity, that is, a lack of underlying infrastructure which would allow them to adapt. This is closely connected with the concept of climate change vulnerability, which is a description of which regions are most vulnerable to climate change. That is, we expect that, for instance, that low-lying islands, for instance, which are only between 2 and 5 feet above sea level, will be grossly inundated as a consequence of sea level rise, and so have very strong vulnerability to underlying climate change. We also observed that the countries most responsible for greenhouse gas emissions were also the ones with the strongest adaptive capacity and the least vulnerability. In fact, some of these countries will have the potential to actually benefit from global climate change. However, regions in the developing and underdeveloped world are probably the most strongly impacted by climate change, even though they are some of the least emitters of greenhouse gases. Okay, so those are the key definitions that you need to know for the final exam. Here are a list of questions which can be asked. Basically, these are concepts which you should be able to explain, and the focus of either multiple choice or the focus of short answer questions. I expect you to know to be able to describe briefly the general circulation of the Earth's atmosphere. This is analogous, for instance, to homework assignment 3, where you had to draw the different circulation patterns on the Earth's surface. You need to know how energy is transported from equator to poles. Remember that there are two main mechanisms. Hadley circulation transports energy from the intertropical convergence zone to the subtropics at 30 degrees north and south, and then extratropical cyclones and tropical cyclones and cyclonic activity or eddy activity is then responsible for transporting energy from the subtropics farther northward. The latitudinal distribution of precipitation is determined by rising and sinking branches of the global circulation. That is, large precipitation in the equatorial regions near the intertropical convergence zone is driven by strong convection within that region. The subtropics are relatively dry by comparison because they are regions of strong subsidence, that is, sinking motion. In regions of sinking motion, there tends to be a lack of precipitation because air is not cooled as it moves, but instead warms as it sinks towards the surface. There are drivers on West Coast and East Coast weather in the U.S. On the West Coast, the primary driver is the Pacific High, which is associated with a southward migration during winter months, bringing atmospheric rivers to the west coast during the winter season. This leads to precipitation peaks, which generally occur during the winter season. On the east coast, they have the Bermuda High. The Bermuda High carries relatively warm, moist Gulf water from the Gulf of Mexico northwards and provides relatively humid, wet conditions to the east coast of the U.S. There are various other drivers to local climate, including topography, how far inland it is located, closeness to the ocean, and local sea surface temperatures at those locations. We discussed in paleoclimate different ways one can reconstruct the Earth's temperature record, the primary mechanism being the usage of benthic delta 18O. That is, differences in oxygen isotopes observed from shells and fossil records from the underlying ocean. This is accompanied with shorter term forecasts using ice core records, particularly from Antarctica and Greenland, as well as tree ring records over the more recent history. One can reconstruct the carbon dioxide record using a combination of ice cores and benthic delta 18O records. The ice cores in particular are useful for carbon dioxide assessments because they actually have little bubbles in them that trap the atmospheric composition at each point in time over the Earth's history. The general distribution of past carbon dioxide was generally increasing the farther you go into the past. Going back to the far, far history 500 million years ago, we actually had carbon dioxide concentrations about 20 times that of present. The relatively rapid recent increase in carbon dioxide is relatively unprecedented, as we have not seen such rapid increases in total atmospheric CO2. The major drivers of historical climate change include both long-term oscillations, including Milankovitch cycles, as well as shifts in, for instance, continental geography. That is, for instance, closing of the Panama Canal, which prevented ocean circulations from occurring worldwide, and so prevented relatively warm Pacific waters from being able to be carried into the Atlantic. There are a number of other drivers here, and I refer you back to the slides in order to review this material. Climate models, we discussed how they are used in order to understand the Earth's climate system and future climate change. In particular, they're basically representations of the underlying Earth system, fairly coarse representations that are run on large-scale parallel computing systems. These climate modeling systems can then be used in order to run experiments. In order to assess future climate, we typically consult with economists in order to build emission models. The emission models are then used in order to build up global carbon dioxide concentrations into the future, and then the climate models are used in order to assess responses in terms of sea surface temperatures to global carbon dioxide concentrations. These models work generally by basically chopping up the Earth's surface into a bunch of grid boxes. Each of the grid boxes then stores relevant quantities associated with the atmosphere, including pressure, wind velocity, temperature, and water vapor content. And then by solving a number of mathematical equations and by representing the underlying physics processes, we come up with a coarse representation of the major processes within the Earth system. So it's basically a representation of all the processes in the Earth system from small scales to large scales. There are a number of main processes that are captured by these models, including radiation, microphysics, that is associated with condensation and precipitation, clouds, surface exchanges, that is, for instance, aerosols picked up from the ocean surface or from vegetation, as well as other processes which are available on the slides. There are different factors that affect the climate system. These include, for instance, natural factors, including solar radiation, volcanism, and natural variability of the underlying system, as well as anthropogenic factors, that is, factors which are driven by human impacts. These include aerosol content, greenhouse gas emissions, and land use changes. I leave it to you to understand how each of these then impact the underlying climate system. There are various fingerprints associated with these factors, and to the best of our knowledge, the observed changes in the tropospheric temperature structure match most closely with those of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Climate change is anticipated to impact California in various ways. We anticipate increased temperatures in response to increased warming, and we anticipate that these increased temperatures will then lead to less snow accumulation, more precipitation in the form of rain rather than snow, and hence less water availability, particularly in summer months. This can be observed in earlier stream flows over the past 50 years. These total precipitation in California is not anticipated to change significantly, but it may end up becoming more extreme due to the increase in ridging events, such as the ridiculously resilient ridge that we saw in 2013 to 2014, but this is compensated for by an increase in total atmospheric water vapor content simply due to the fact that warmer air holds more water vapor. The climate change will affect Sierra Nevada snowpack by again preventing snow accumulation and having that and instead having that precipitation be in the form of rain. So we anticipate a major decrease in total Sierra Nevada snowpack over the next 100 years. Emission scenarios are constructed, again, by consulting with economists and using basically estimates of GDP growth in order to build up models of total carbon dioxide emissions that are necessary in order to support that economic growth. We discussed future anticipated changes to global average surface temperatures under different scenarios. Namely, we anticipate under the weaker scenarios, we're going to see a 2-degree rise in surface temperatures by the middle of the century and the end of the century. Whereas under the business as usual scenario, we were seeing a 2-degree rise by the middle of the century, followed by a 6 to 8 degree rise by the end of the century. Future anticipated changes to sea ice extent. We anticipate that sea ice, in particular in the North Polar regions, will contract substantially, and we expect under the business as usual scenario that sea ice will disappear entirely. In terms of precipitation, we anticipate wetter areas of the world will become wetter and drier areas of the world will become drier, even though total precipitation worldwide will generally increase. With increased carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere, we anticipate that the ocean will uptake this carbon dioxide and form carbonic acid, leading to a decrease in pH or increasing ocean acidity worldwide. Again, with regards to mountain snowpack, we anticipate a general decrease in total mountain snowpack worldwide. There are various aspects we discussed about the different oscillations. I would suggest focusing in particular on the El Niño Southern Oscillation and the teleconnections associated with the ENSO. In particular, the key aspects to remember: ENSO El Niño conditions are associated with a relatively dry West Pacific and otherwise global warmer, wetter conditions. The main mechanism behind ENSO I described earlier, and it is strongly connected with tropical dynamics and in particular the Walker circulation. I refer you back to those slides. If you have any questions, again, please email me, and I'll be happy to answer your questions as rapidly as possible. We discussed the causes of the 2013 to 2014 California drought, in particular the formation of the ridiculously resilient ridge off the west coast. We discussed whether or not the drought was unprecedented in the climate record of California, and we discussed how precipitation is expected to change in California in the coming century. Specifically, we anticipate no significant change in precipitation in California over the next 100 years. We discussed mitigation and adaptation and the connection between the two. We discussed several good examples of mitigation and several good examples of adaptation. I refer you to the slides in order to remember some of those examples. It is almost certain that mitigation and adaptation will be asked on the final exam. Okay, that is everything. So good luck. Best of luck reviewing. If you have any questions, again, please ask me. Also, on the day of the exam, on Monday, June 8th, I will be in my office for most of the day. I will email you later as well about office hours that I'll be hosting. All right, good luck.